Conflict is not a modern invention. It has existed since the dawn of humanity, when survival depended on stone tools, fire, and territory. In harsh environments with limited resources, any outsider, especially one who looked or acted differently, was perceived as a threat. The most efficient response? Push them back, eliminate them, or kill them. Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals were no exception. Though both descended from a common ancestor, hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution had turned them into two distinct human species with different bodies, behaviors, and social structures. When Homo sapiens, Cro-Magnons, migrated out of Africa and into Europe, they did not arrive in an uninhabited land. Neanderthals had already been there for millennia. They knew the terrain, the animals, the seasons, but now the land belonged to two kinds of humans. One would have to retreat. The encounter was not a partnership, it was a competition, brutal, silent, and inevitable. Sharing the same ecological niche, hunting the same prey, and occupying the same spaces, the two species entered a war without declarations. There were no borders, no flags, no negotiations, but the outcome was decisive. One species survived, the other disappeared. This was not merely a skirmish between rival tribes, it was the first global war in the evolutionary history of our planet. And its legacy still echoes in us, carved into our genomes, shaping the instincts we carry, and reminding us that our path to dominance was paved not just with innovation, but with blood. Two faces of humanity. At first glance, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were both unmistakably human. But the differences between them were visible, immediate, and profound. These were not subtle variations within a single population. They were two separate branches of humanity, shaped by different climates, different pressures, and different paths. Neanderthals were shorter, broader, and powerfully built. Their limbs were stocky, their torsos wide, adapted for conserving heat in cold environments. Their faces were dominated by a large nose, heavy brow ridges, and a receding chin, traits well suited to glacial Europe, but unfamiliar to the newcomers from Africa. Cro-Magnons, by contrast, stood taller, often exceeding 180 centimeters. Their limbs were longer, their bodies leaner, resembling modern humans from tropical regions. They had flatter faces, smaller noses, and more delicate bone structure. To Neanderthals, they must have seemed alien. To Cro-Magnons, the feeling was likely mutual. These visible differences mattered. In a world where survival depended on immediate judgments, friend or foe, threat or kin, appearance was everything. The two groups may have shared an ancestor, but by the time they met, they no longer shared identity. The human brain is wired to notice contrast, and in this case, the contrast ran deep, not only in bone and muscle, but in tool use, behavior, and culture. The result was tension, not trust, recognition, not resemblance, and over time, that tension would shape the outcome of their coexistence. Evolution does not always favor peace. Sometimes, it rewards the group that sees the other as different and acts on that perception. The Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons were two faces of humanity, but history would choose only one to endure: brains that divided us. At birth, the brains of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon infants were almost identical in size and shape. For a brief moment, the two species began life on equal cognitive ground. But as they aged, the similarities faded. Their brains developed along different trajectories, and those differences would shape the fate of both species. While Neanderthals had slightly larger overall brain volume, Cro-Magnons had an edge in something far more critical: the structure of the cerebellum. This part of the brain, often overlooked, plays a key role in coordination, memory, imagination, and, most importantly, social behavior. It's not just about movement, it's about the mind's ability to model others, to predict actions, to build alliances. Cro-Magnons used this cognitive advantage to form larger, more cohesive social groups. They didn't just survive together, they strategized, shared knowledge, and built networks of trust. This made them more effective in every arena of survival: hunting, defense, childcare, and long-term planning. Neanderthals, by comparison, lived in smaller family-based units. Their social world was narrower. Their collaborative reach was limited. This divergence in brain function wasn't visible to the naked eye, but its consequences were vast. The ability to cooperate at scale, across extended families, across generations, is a defining trait of Homo sapiens. It is the reason we built cities, crossed oceans, and reached the moon. But in its earliest form, it gave Cro-Magnons a battlefield advantage, not with brute strength, but with unity. In the competition for space and survival, it wasn't just about who was stronger. It was about who could think together. And in that contest, Cro-Magnons were already pulling ahead. 4. Neanderthal culture. Neanderthals have long been misrepresented as brutish, emotionless, and primitive. But archaeological evidence paints a different picture, one that challenges the stereotype and reveals a species with depth, empathy, and emerging cultural complexity. Across Europe and parts of Western Asia, Neanderthal remains have been discovered with signs of long-term injury and illness, healed fractures, degenerative diseases, and severe disabilities. These individuals survived not because they were physically strong, but because someone cared for them. In the harsh Pleistocene world, survival of the weak required social support. That support means something: compassion, obligation, memory. There are signs that Neanderthals buried their dead. Bodies placed in shallow graves, sometimes with stone tools or animal remains, suggest the early stirrings of ritual. Perhaps they believed in an afterlife. Perhaps they simply mourned. But whatever the motive, it marked a leap beyond instinct, toward meaning. Cave walls tell a similar story. In Spain and France, red ochre markings, hand stencils, and geometric shapes predate the arrival of Homo sapiens. If confirmed, these would be the oldest known cave art on Earth, and they weren't made by Cro-Magnons. They were Neanderthal creations. Simple, yes, but intentional. Symbolic. They also used ornaments: claws, feathers, pierced shells, objects that serve no clear practical function, but may have expressed identity, status, or belief. This is not the culture of a mindless predator. It is the early architecture of thought, of society, of ritual, of emotion, the foundations of what we now call humanity. Neanderthals were not a lesser species. They were a different kind of human, one with the spark of culture already burning, even if it never became a firestorm. Silent conquest. There is no evidence of a grand war between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. No smoking spears. No mass graves lined with fallen warriors. The archaeological record tells a quieter story, one not of battles, but of displacement, pressure, and slow erosion. Cro-Magnons arrived in Europe with advantages that had nothing to do with violence. Larger group sizes, more efficient tools, stronger social bonds, and flexible survival strategies. They expanded steadily, occupying fertile valleys, riversides, and hunting grounds. They moved quickly, adapted easily, and brought with them innovations that shifted the balance of survival. Neanderthals, already established in these regions, found themselves gradually pushed to the edges, into harsher, less resource-rich environments: cold mountains, deep forests, barren plateaus. These were not ideal refuges, but they were the only spaces left. This was not conquest by sword. It was conquest by numbers, by systems, by time. Each generation of Cro-Magnon children grew up with more tools, more knowledge, and more territory than the last. Each generation of Neanderthals had fewer options, fewer allies, fewer chances. In some regions, Neanderthals disappeared without a trace. In others, they lingered for centuries before vanishing. Their extinction was not a moment, it was a process, one so gradual that no one species may have even noticed it was happening. But the outcome was absolute. Without fanfare or formal defeat, Neanderthals were gone. What replaced them was not just a different body, but a different system. A culture that expanded not through war, but through persistence, through adaptation, through quiet, unstoppable growth. The Neanderthals didn't fall in battle, they faded in silence. 6. Tools of survival. In the prehistoric world, survival depended on more than strength. It depended on technology. The ability to shape stone, wood, and bone into effective tools was the difference between eating and starving, between defense and defeat. And in this arena, Homo sapiens held the upper hand. Neanderthals were skilled toolmakers. They crafted sturdy hand axes, stone scrapers, and short, thick spears. But their weapons were largely designed for close-range encounters, thrusting, not throwing. This meant hunting was riskier. They had to get close to large, dangerous prey. Injuries were common. Mortality was high. Cro-Magnons, by contrast, brought something new to the battlefield of survival: the spear thrower, or atlatl. This deceptively simple device, a carved extension of the arm, allowed hunters to launch projectiles with far greater force and distance. It transformed the dynamics of hunting. Prey could be killed from afar. Threats could be neutralized without direct confrontation. The advantages multiplied. Distance meant safety. Precision meant efficiency. A successful hunt meant more food, less risk, and greater reproductive success. Over time, Cro-Magnons hunted more effectively, sustained larger groups, and expanded into new territories with confidence. This technological edge wasn't limited to weapons. Cro-Magnons also developed more refined cutting tools, bone needles, and composite implements. They engineered flexibility. Their tools could be repaired, adapted, and specialized for different environments. In evolutionary terms, tools are extensions of the mind. They allow a species to shape the world to its advantage. And while Neanderthals relied on brute force, Homo sapiens refined the art of distance, precision, and innovation. The battlefield was not always covered in blood. Sometimes it was won by a sharpened edge, thrown from a safer distance. The diet that killed a species. Survival is not only about strength or intelligence, it is also about what you eat. And in a changing world, dietary flexibility becomes a matter of life and death. Neanderthals were skilled hunters. Stable isotope analysis of their bones shows a diet dominated by animal protein, primarily large game like mammoths, bison, and reindeer. In some regions, they also gathered plants, nuts, and seafood, but these additions were often limited and localized. Each Neanderthal group relied heavily on a specific type of food available in their immediate environment. This ecological specialization worked until the environment changed. When prey migrated, vanished, or became scarce due to climate shifts or human competition, Neanderthal groups often had no fallback strategy. Their survival systems were narrow, and in the unforgiving Ice Age, narrow meant fragile. Cro-Magnons approached food differently. Their diet was more varied, more balanced, and more adaptable. They consumed both plants and animals in diverse combinations. They shifted strategies depending on the landscape. When large game was scarce, they fished. When plants were abundant, they gathered. They used fire to cook, grindstones to process seeds, and eventually, smoke to preserve meat. This dietary flexibility gave Homo sapiens a critical edge. It allowed them to survive in forests, grasslands, coasts, and highlands. It supported population growth. It reduced the risk of starvation when conditions changed. In contrast, the Neanderthal reliance on a specific protein-heavy diet made them vulnerable to even small disruptions in the food chain. As ecosystems shifted and competition increased, their options narrowed, and many simply didn't survive the hunger that followed. In the end, extinction can come not with a weapon, but with an empty stomach. 8. Bones tell of brutality. The fossil record rarely lies. Buried beneath layers of soil and time, bones preserve a truth that words never did. And in the case of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, that truth is violent. Archaeological excavations across Europe have uncovered Neanderthal skeletons bearing clear signs of trauma: fractured skulls, puncture wounds, blunt force injuries. Many of these wounds were not caused by accidents or animal attacks. They were deliberate: blows to the head, cuts made with tools, kill shots. Some bones tell an even darker story. Marks consistent with defleshing, dismemberment, and gnawing suggest episodes of cannibalism, not symbolic, but survival-driven. Whether it was famine, warfare, or social breakdown, the evidence points to a grim reality. Both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens may have killed and consumed their enemies. And it wasn't one-sided. Homo sapiens skeletons from the same period also bear the marks of violence. Skulls split open, rib cages pierced. This was not a massacre of the defenseless. It was mutual hostility, localized, brutal, and recurring. These were not global wars in the modern sense, but pockets of lethal contact. Border skirmishes, resource conflicts, clashes were hunting grounds. And in each encounter, ancient humans did what they knew best. They fought for survival, sometimes to the death. The archaeological record doesn't name heroes or villains. It simply shows that no species was innocent. When two branches of humanity met on the edge of a continent, peace was not the default. The bones remember what history forgot. 9 shared blood conflict tells one part of the story, but genetics tells another. Despite the competition, despite the violence, Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals did not remain entirely separate. They met, they lived near one another, and at times, they reproduced. Today, nearly every person of non-African descent carries traces of Neanderthal DNA, between 1 and 2%. These are not random fragments. They are inherited sequences passed down through thousands of generations, evidence of ancient contact, evidence of interbreeding. This genetic mixing likely occurred early in Homo sapiens' expansion into Eurasia, before Neanderthals disappeared. Small groups of Cro-Magnons arriving in Neanderthal territory did not only bring conflict, they also brought contact, and through that contact, hybrids were born. These children would have carried features from both parents, a blend of two lineages, one shaped by Ice Age Europe, the other by the African savannas. Their presence challenges the idea of a strict divide between species. It shows that even in times of tension, biology found a way to merge. The interbreeding was not widespread or frequent, but it was enough. Enough to leave a legacy. Enough to remind us that extinction does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means absorption. The Neanderthals did not vanish completely. A part of them still walks the earth, inside us. Not just in our bones or faces, but deep in our cells, in our blood. The line between us and them was never as sharp as we once believed. 10. Man's best advantage. In the race for survival, Homo sapiens had more than tools and numbers. They had allies, some with fur, and others built into their biology. One of the most unexpected turning points in human evolution may have been the domestication of the dog. Emerging evidence suggests that Cro-Magnons began forming symbiotic relationships with wolves, animals that could track prey, guard camps, and sense danger before humans could. Over generations, those wolves became something new: dogs. These animals expanded the human sensory range. They could smell what we couldn't, hear what we missed, and in return, they gained food, shelter, and protection. It was a partnership unlike anything Neanderthals ever developed. And in the wild, every small advantage mattered. But the edge wasn't just canine, it was also cognitive. Homo sapiens evolved a small but powerful adaptation: the white sclera of the eye. Unlike Neanderthals and most other primates, our eyes clearly reveal the direction of our gaze. This made silent communication possible. With just a glance, humans could signal danger, intention, or direction without a sound. This enhanced gaze following allowed for better coordination, more efficient teamwork, and tighter social bonds. In hunting, it meant synchronized movement. In conflict, it meant strategy. In daily life, it meant trust. Together, dogs and visible eyes helped Homo sapiens do something critical: collaborate without words. The Neanderthals were strong, but Cro-Magnons could look and be seen, and that made all the difference. 11. A plague from the tropics. Neanderthals left Africa long before Homo sapiens did, by some estimates more than 150,000 years earlier. In that time, their immune systems adapted to the pathogens of Ice Age Europe, but they remained unprepared for what was coming. When Cro-Magnons began migrating out of Africa, they didn't come alone. They carried fire, tools, language, and microbes. Viruses, bacteria, and parasites that had evolved in the tropics traveled silently within them. To Homo sapiens, these pathogens were familiar, often harmless. But to Neanderthals, they were foreign and deadly. This wasn't intentional. It wasn't war. But the result was no less devastating. As contact between the two species increased, so did exposure. A handshake, a shared water source, a contaminated carcass, any of these could transmit illness. And with no natural immunity, Neanderthal populations may have suffered catastrophic losses. This theory, known as the pathogen exchange hypothesis, frames extinction not as a battlefield defeat, but as a biological collapse, a kind of unintentional biological warfare, waged not by soldiers, but by cells. Modern parallels are hard to find. History is filled with examples of isolated populations devastated by new diseases. The difference here is that it may have been the first time this happened between two human species. If true, it means the fate of the Neanderthals wasn't decided only by tools or tactics, but by invisible forces carried across continents by those who came after. Sometimes, the most powerful weapons are the ones we never see. 12. Volcanoes and hunger. Sometimes extinction doesn't come from an enemy. It comes from the Earth itself. Roughly 40,000 years ago, several massive volcanic eruptions rocked parts of Europe and Western Asia, precisely when Neanderthal populations were already in decline. These eruptions weren't isolated events. They were climate-altering catastrophes. Ash clouds blocked the sun, temperatures plummeted, rainfall patterns shifted, ecosystems collapsed. For Neanderthals, already pushed to ecological margins, this was a final blow. Their survival depended on large herbivores, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer. When the plants died, the animals followed, and when the animals vanished, Neanderthals had little left to hunt. Their narrow diets, honed over generations, offered no backup plan. Cro-Magnons, with their broader toolkits and more varied food strategies, endured. They fished, foraged, adapted. Neanderthals starved. This wasn't a battle, it was a chain reaction. Volcanic ash to climate shift, to ecological collapse, to famine. An extinction not of combat, but of cascading consequences. Some researchers call this the ecological stress hypothesis. It suggests that Neanderthals didn't lose to Homo sapiens. They lost to nature at the worst possible moment. Their timing was unlucky. Their resilience was limited, and the world changed faster than they could. In the end, no spear was needed. The final blow may have come from a sky gone dark, a forest gone silent, and a stomach left empty. Nature, not violence, may have delivered the finishing act. A last rival. Nature doesn't negotiate. When two species occupy the same ecological niche, only one usually survives. Competition isn't always violent, but it is always decisive. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived side by side. They hunted the same animals, sheltered in the same caves, used fire, tools, and language, but only one would endure. The other would become a memory, buried in soil, bone, and fragments of DNA. If Neanderthals had prevailed, our world might look very different. Different minds shaping history, different hands building cities, different voices telling stories. Perhaps they, not we, would be the ones making documentaries about a vanished cousin. But that isn't what happened. Through a combination of adaptability, innovation, social complexity, and sheer luck, Homo sapiens survived and expanded. We became the last humans standing. The disappearance of Neanderthals was not the result of a single event. It was a slow unraveling, a mixture of climate shocks, biological disadvantages, and cultural displacement. Some died in conflict, others from hunger. Many simply were absorbed. And now only one species is left to remember both. We are not separate from that past. We are its product, its witness, and in some ways, its final chapter. The Neanderthals were not failures. They were our rivals, and for a time, they nearly shared the future with us. But history chose only one.